A young servant girl, no more than 14, locked inside the queen's private chamber. The walls press in like stone coffins, their shadows dancing under the weak flicker of torches. The smell of melting wax clings to her breath, thick, suffocating, as muffled cries echo from corridors she cannot see. Her hands tremble against the cold iron latch, though she knows escape is impossible. Every step approaching feels like thunder, measured, deliberate, inescapable. She tells herself the queen is merciful, that the stories whispered by other servants are only tales meant to frighten the weak. But when the door creaks open, she sees not mercy, but a smile, slow, cruel, carved across painted lips. A smile that promises no salvation, only suffering. The girl's pulse hammers against her throat as the footsteps stop before her. The chamber grows silent, heavy with dread, and history will tell you she was loved by her people, yet none heard. The screams in the dark, and history will tell you she was loved by her people, yet none heard the screams in the dark. To the world beyond palace walls, she was the vision of grace. Draped in gowns of silk, her crown glinting like a shard of sun, she stood upon balconies as musicians played and petals rained from baskets below. Painters immortalized her beauty, poets praised her piety, and children were taught to bow as though in the presence of a living goddess. She was the mother of her nation, the jewel of her dynasty, the face carved onto coins and woven into tapestries. But step beyond the marble halls and velvet curtains, and the truth twists into something darker. Behind every smile at court lingered silence, because the women who spoke too boldly disappeared, their names scratched from records. The very hands that blessed newborns in public signed death warrants in private. Palaces that glittered with gold by day became prisons by night. The perfume of roses masked the stench of burning flesh. Historians wrote of her wisdom, yet in the margins of forgotten scrolls lie warnings, whispers of cruelty too dangerous to preserve. She was adored, celebrated, worshipped, yet her reign was built on bones carefully hidden beneath polished floors. The contrast is stark. A queen who kissed children in parades, yet consigned others to nameless graves. What history celebrated was a mask hiding a nightmare. What history celebrated was a mask hiding a nightmare. The mask begins to crack when we search the shadows of the past. Ancient chroniclers, writing in the margins of papyrus scrolls, hinted at horrors too dangerous to record openly. One fragment, translated from a faded Egyptian manuscript, speaks of women of power who bathed in the cries of the innocent. Greek travelers, welcomed into the courts, whispered of chambers that guests were never permitted to see, and carved into forbidden inscriptions, later chiseled away, are symbols that scholars now interpret as coded warnings. Archaeology, too, has revealed its testimony. Excavations near palace burial pits uncovered skeletal remains bearing cut marks not of war, but of ritualized torment. Bones fractured in deliberate patterns, suggesting executions disguised as ceremonies. In one chamber, layers of ash mixed with human teeth hint at fires that burned not incense, but flesh. Even the soil retains the signature of something unspeakable, and then there are the voices of those who lived it. Court slaves, in scattered testimonies smuggled across centuries, spoke in hushed tones of torture conducted under the veil of night. They described ropes that never loosened, blades that gleamed beneath torchlight, and a queen's laughter echoing against the stone, as if cruelty itself was performance. Most of this evidence, once uncovered, was quietly locked away. Museums refused to display artifacts. Translations of papyrus scrolls were edited, stripped of their darkest lines. The official narrative remained polished, sterile, while the truth was buried deeper than the victims themselves. But history does not remain silent forever. Fragments endured, whispers, bones, scorched walls, enough to reconstruct a story of unimaginable cruelty, but fragments survived. Enough to reconstruct their cruelty, but fragments survived. Enough to reconstruct their cruelty. And what they reveal is not the chaos of madness, but the precision of a machine. At the top sat the queen herself, her command sharper than any blade. A single word from her lips could seal a fate. That word flowed downward, to the chamberlain, keeper of her secrets, who ensured her desires were translated into orders. The chamberlain whispered to captains of the guard, who then delivered prisoners to executioners trained not in battle, but in controlled suffering. At the bottom lay the victims, peasants, rivals, even loyal servants, caught in a chain they could not escape. The palace itself became the architecture of fear. Secret corridors carried prisoners unseen. Locked cellars, disguised as wine vaults, doubled as chambers of torment. Thick drapes muffled screams, while gardens bloomed above graves no one dared disturb. Records expose the cold efficiency of this system. Clay tablets and papyrus ledgers contain lists, not of taxes, but of the condemned. Each entry marked with chilling brevity, silenced, cleansed, sacrificed. Temple priests recorded the deaths as rituals, not punishments. To the public, blood was worship. To the victims, it was obliteration, and cruelty wore the mask of ceremony. Servants were paraded as offerings. Poisonings took place during feasts, cloaked in religious blessing. The queen's brutality was woven into the rhythms of state, so routine that the machinery of horror turned with terrifying smoothness. Every cog in this machine knew its place. Guards obeyed without question, scribes erased without hesitation, priests sanctified without shame. All of it revolved around one woman's will, as if cruelty itself had been institutionalized. This was not madness erupting in shadows. It was governance in its purest, most twisted form. An empire of suffering, administered with precision, hidden beneath crowns of gold. It wasn't chaos. It was a system. It wasn't chaos. It was a system. But a system built to kill does not stay hidden forever. Layer by layer, its brutality unfolded, each chapter darker than the last. The first to suffer were the dissenters, the voices that rose too boldly against the throne. At first, punishment seemed restrained, almost ordinary. Exile to remote provinces, public shaming in markets. But the cruelty deepened quickly. Those who spoke against her policies returned to the city with faces branded by hot iron, their cheeks seared with symbols of treason. Others vanished entirely, dragged into palace corridors at night, never seen again. Families were forced to eat at empty tables, their loved ones' names struck from every ledger, and silence became the queen's greatest weapon. The disappearances were not loud, not spectacular. They were surgical. A poet gone by morning, a merchant stripped of his stall, a noble's daughter missing from her bed. The absence itself became terror. Fear seeped into every household. People lowered their voices, avoiding eye contact, praying their names would not appear on the next list. The queen's smile remained radiant, her image flawless. But beneath it, dissenters were being erased. But that was only the beginning. Soon, cruelty was no longer confined to shadows. It was sanctified. The queen, hailed as a divine mother, transformed punishment into worship. Festivals once meant for joy became stages of blood. Victims were paraded through temple gates, garlands around their necks, as if chosen for honor. Priests chanted hymns, musicians played, while guards bound wrists and ankles in chains dipped in oil. The ceremony was carefully choreographed, every movement, every chant calculated to mask agony as devotion. Inside the ritual chambers, the true horror unfolded. Knives cut flesh not for sacrifice to gods, but to satisfy the queen's thirst for control. Blood pooled beneath altars, while incense smoke tried, and failed, to disguise the stench of burning skin. Crowds were told the gods demanded it. In truth, it was the queen who demanded silence, obedience, fear, and children watched, believing cruelty was sacred. Songs were composed about the chosen ones, disguising the screams of the dying. The line between worship and execution vanished, but that was only the beginning. What happens when a queen grows bored of spectacle? She turns inward, experimenting on those closest, those powerless to resist. Servants became test subjects. Food tasters were forced to swallow cups of poison, not to ensure safety, but to measure how long death took. Some were locked in rooms without food or water, studied as their bodies withered under starvation. Others were mutilated, their wounds examined by palace physicians ordered to record every stage of decay. The cruelty was systematic. Ledger notes recovered centuries later described dosages, symptoms, durations, clinical records of suffering. Victims were reduced to entries, their humanity erased beneath columns of ink, and the queen watched. Accounts whisper of her presence in these chambers, veiled and silent, eyes fixed on the trembling bodies of her servants. She did not look away when they screamed. She did not flinch when they begged. She only asked how much longer it would take. Behind silk curtains, science and sadism intertwined. Servants once entrusted with carrying trays of wine or folding royal gowns were transformed into tools of torment, but that was only the beginning. No cruelty remains contained forever. In time, it turns inward, devouring even those closest. The queen's paranoia grew. Brothers accused of plotting treason were dragged from feasts and strangled before servants. Sons rumored to be ambitious vanished from their chambers. One husband, according to a surviving chronicler, was poisoned at his own table, his goblet filled by the queen herself. Even daughters were not spared. A rival princess, beloved by the people for her gentleness, was married off, only to die within weeks under mysterious illness. Rumors spread that the queen had ordered poison slipped into her bridal cup, silencing a potential threat before it bloomed. Palace halls that once echoed with music now whispered with suspicion. Every relative became a rival. Every banquet a potential execution. The family tree, meant to preserve dynasty, was pruned by the queen's own hand until it was little more than a skeleton. In the end, even the crown itself trembled under her paranoia. But that was only the beginning. The night of the grand festival was meant to be a celebration of abundance. The palace glittered with lanterns strung across marble columns, their flames casting golden light that shimmered against silk banners. Music filled the air, flutes, drums, and the haunting echo of stringed instruments, while dancers twirled across the floor, their jeweled veils catching the torchlight like fragments of stars. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, candied fruits, and chalices overflowing with wine as red as blood. Guests, nobles, priests, foreign envoys, laughed nervously, raising their cups in honor of the queen who sat upon her elevated throne, radiant in gold. Yet beneath the pageantry, unease lingered. The queen's smile was too sharp, her gaze too steady, as if she were waiting for something unseen. And then, as the musicians struck their loudest note, the torches dimmed. One by one, flames sputtered out until the hall was cloaked in darkness. The laughter faltered, the drums fell silent, and only the crackle of wax dripping from half-burned candles filled the air. When the light returned, the doors had opened. Guards entered, not with gifts, but with captives. Bound and trembling, the victims were led forward, their eyes wide with terror. They were dressed in ceremonial robes, wreaths forced upon their heads to disguise their agony as honor. The crowd froze, their breaths caught in their throats. Some thought it a ritual, a performance. But the fear in the prisoners' eyes told the truth. The queen rose. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her chalice, signaling the beginning of what she called the offering. The music resumed, but now its rhythm was discordant, feverish, like the beating of 1,000 hearts under strain. Executioners moved among the victims, their blades gleaming with fresh oil. The first cry tore through the hall as a young man's throat was cut, his body crumpling beside the banquet table. Blood spilled across the polished floor, seeping beneath the feet of horrified guests. Some turned away, some wept, but none dared to intervene. The queen remained seated, sipping her wine as though tasting the sweetness of the harvest itself. Then came the women, pulled to their knees before the throne. Their pleas for mercy were drowned out by the rising chant of priests, sanctifying murder with holy words. With each stroke of the blade, the queen's smile widened. The festival of abundance had become a theater of death. One envoy is said to have collapsed, unable to bear the sight. Another scribbled hurried notes, later smuggled beyond the palace walls, describing the massacre as a celebration where laughter turned to screams. The queen silenced none of it. On the contrary, she wanted witnesses. Terror was her currency, and she spent it lavishly. The executions stretched through the night. Chalices were refilled. Songs resumed between screams, and the marble floors turned slick with blood. By the time the last victim fell, silence had become unbearable. The queen raised her hands, and the festival ended, not with prayer, not with mourning, but with applause coerced from trembling lips. The survivors left with their stomachs knotted and their souls scarred, carrying nightmares they would never dare speak aloud. And when dawn rose, the blood had already been scrubbed from the marble floors. So too, history itself was scrubbed clean. What remained of those nights of terror was slowly erased, not by time, but by deliberate hands. Later scholars, tasked with preserving dynasties, destroyed incriminating texts. Chronicles that once hinted at cruelty were recopied, their lines softened, their meaning twisted, until the queen became a saint of mercy rather than a ruler of fear. Artifacts uncovered by accident, broken shackles, scorched daggers, ledgers of sacrifices were hidden away in museum basements, locked behind doors labeled restricted collection. Curators whispered that such items did not fit the narrative of glory tourists came to see. Better to leave them in the dark than to confront the truth. Even translations of papyrus fragments were altered. Where original scribes described blood offerings and weeping altars, later editions spoke of festivals and songs of blessing. One word changed, one phrase erased, and the brutality was transformed into piety. Art suffered the same fate. Frescoes once depicting bound captives were deliberately whitewashed. Mosaics showing pools of blood shattered and reassembled into harmless geometric patterns. The walls of history were not blank by accident. They were made blank by choice. We like to believe the ancients hid their crimes, but the truth is far more unsettling. They recorded everything. The screams, the rituals, the blood. It was we who buried them. Modernity, with its obsession for polished legends, chose to protect the crown's image rather than confront the horror that lay beneath. And so, behind glass displays and golden statues, the screams remain unheard. The ancients recorded the screams. It was we who buried them, The ancients recorded the screams. It was we who buried them. But some horrors refused to stay buried. For in the end, the cruelty of these queens reached its most unthinkable form, not against soldiers, nor rivals, nor traitors, but against children. Records whisper of festivals where the youngest were chosen as pure offerings, sons of rivals, daughters of servants, even infants pulled from their mother's arms. The belief, twisted, vile, was that the younger the blood, the stronger the gods' favor. What began as executions of dissenters evolved into the slaughter of innocents. One account, pieced together from scattered testimonies, describes a night when the queen demanded silence from her court. A boy, no older than 10, was dragged before the throne. His small hands clutched a wooden flute, a toy given to him by the very guards who now forced him forward. Trembling, he was ordered to play, to sing for his ruler. The hall filled with the fragile melody of a child's breath, wavering, breaking, echoing off the marble walls, and as he played, executioners circled closer. The music faltered when the blade touched his shoulder. Guests turned their eyes away, tears hidden behind jeweled masks. The queen, however, leaned forward with fascination, her smile frozen in something between worship and cruelty. With one final note, the boy's song ended, silenced by a strike that shattered more than just flesh. It was not an isolated act. Chroniclers speak of loyal servants executed out of suspicion, sons betrayed by their own mother's hand, and children of noble families slaughtered to prevent rebellion before it could ever take root. The paranoia that once consumed her court had devoured even the innocent. No one was untouchable, no bond sacred. Archaeological traces corroborate the whispers. Tiny bones unearthed in palace burial pits, far too small to belong to warriors. Ritual vessels bearing soot and fragments of toys. The evidence is undeniable, even when museums refuse to display it. This was the final stage of her reign. The last evolution of power corrupted beyond recognition. Cruelty turned inward, devouring the future itself. Children were no longer heirs or blessings. They were weapons, pawns, sacrifices, disposable proof of a queen's absolute control. And yet, centuries later, the gilded statues remain. Histories still call them divine. Tour guides praise their wisdom, poets their beauty. Their portraits hang in museums as paragons of majesty. Their crowns were heavy with blood. And history still dares to call them divine. Their crowns were heavy with blood. And history still dares to call them divine. Step back for a moment, and the pattern becomes undeniable. Power corrupts absolutely, yet when that power is crowned in gold, it corrupts with a beauty that blinds its witnesses. These queens were not born as monsters. They became monsters because no one dared to oppose them. Their courts were silent. Their people were paralyzed by fear. Their scholars rewrote the truth until cruelty looked like grace. And what of the victims? Most remain nameless, erased from ledgers, scrubbed from frescoes, cast into unmarked graves. Yet their pain echoes still, in the bones found beneath palace floors, in the fragments of testimonies preserved against all odds. They had no crowns, no marble statues, no tapestries. Their legacy is silence, a silence heavy enough to haunt us centuries later. Luxury is always the mask. Behind silks and golden chalices, behind songs of glory, cruelty hides in plain sight. Every empire tells the world of its beauty, while burying its ugliness in the dark. The tragedy of these queens is not only what they did, but how their people allowed it. How power becomes sacred when wrapped in velvet, and how resistance dies in whispers. History paints them radiant, but step behind the curtain and you find only bones, and every empire leaves skeletons behind its silk curtains, and every empire leaves skeletons behind its silk curtains. Another empire, another throne, another ruler hiding nightmares in velvet. The setting changes, the crowns differ, the banners fly in new colors, but the cruelty remains the same. Behind every song of glory is a chamber of silence. Behind every golden crown is a shadow dripping with blood. If you think the queens were cruel, wait until you hear how kings carved empires from rivers of blood. They built monuments on bones, carved laws from screams, and turned conquest into a theater of horror greater than any court ritual. That story is next, and it is darker still, so uncover it with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below, because in confronting the past, we confront the truths we still choose to bury, because history's darkest truths are the ones we must never forget.